Now, the coming of the O'Reillys. As I'm sure you're all aware, the lines between academia and the outside world can sometimes be a little confused. For me, one of the outsiders, as I said before, this has recently become apparent as I tried to work out the difference between public history and personal family anecdote. I'm only gradually beginning to understand some of the complexities involved, but I know there is a lot that I yet have to learn. For those of us untrained in the more formal and specific requirements of properly recorded history for public purposes, recording any form of history almost invariably involves that of our own families, tracing our forebears back as far as possible and seeing how widely spread the greater family has become since those first brave migrants arrived in New Zealand perhaps a century and a half ago. And I would venture to suggest that what is sometimes seen as the more intimate personal family history can and probably should have some strong application in the world of public history. If I lived in Canterbury, I'd delight in telling all and sundry as often as I could that my great-great-grandmother arrived on the Charlotte Jane, the first of the 4 ships that brought the original settlement group to the region from England. She, with her husband George Field, from whom I get my surname, had 11 sons, and thus the name was well established and has since become widespread. And if you'll pardon the pun, fields now have expanded into farms all over the country. But for Cantabrians, tracing one's history back to one of the first 4 ships is of significance. And while this paper is not about me nor the Field family, this observation of family expansion may serve to illustrate that almost all of us have broad family backgrounds and that in many instances families have branches and descendants that are now spread extensively throughout New Zealand and elsewhere. I'd like to recount a little detail of one of those families, one that in my opinion is in no way mundane and which now in just 125 years has added well over 800 descendants to the nation. It's a brief glimpse at the O'Reillys, whose arrival in New Zealand happened like this. In 1879, 24-year-old Philip O'Reilly's father gave him a horse and told him to sell it at the local fair. So young Philip took the horse to the village of Muller in the Irish county of Cavan and sold it and did a runner with the money, using it to buy himself a passage to New Zealand. How often did this happen, I wonder? Young men and sometimes young women finding some method by which they could free themselves from what was probably a dreadful situation of overcrowding, no work prospects, degradation and total hopelessness. It'd be those with gumption, guts and determination to do better no matter what the odds who took that leap of faith. And perhaps that's part of the reason why we're such a gutsy little nation. With those sorts of forebears, why would we not be? Young Philip arrived, felt that he had a good reason to bolt, and he left Ireland on July 12, 1879, arriving in Lyttelton after a 3-month voyage on SS Rankatiki, and he quickly got employment because there was plenty of it about in those days. He thrived in his new home, and within 5 years he had somehow accumulated enough money, or enough wealth at least, to help his father, his mother, and his 5 sisters and 4 brothers to also migrate to New Zealand, where they joined him in Palmerston North. They'd obviously forgiven him. And his brothers were Patrick, Thomas, David and John Joseph, and his 5 sisters were Bridget, Mary, Catherine, Alice and Roseanne. Most of them remained in the Palmerston North area, and while all but David married, only 2 of Philip's brothers, Thomas and John Joseph, had families to carry on the O'Reilly name. But Philip himself also married 4 years after helping his family come to the other side of the world. And in 1886, he won a land ballot at Apathy, northeast of Fielding, and shortly after he took up that land, he and several hired hands were abruptly woken one night by what they presumed was a pitched battle between government soldiers and Māori. It wasn't until several days later that they established that the long series of blasts and explosions they heard was in fact the massive eruption of Mount Tarawera. In July 1888, Philip married Rose O'Donnell, and they brought up a family of 13 children, including 7 boys. And it was largely these sons, Tom and Walter, Jack, Roy, who was actually a nephew, Philip, Patrick and Lionel Vincent, who was known as Peter, was largely these boys who ensured that the O'Reilly name was strongly established in New Zealand. Now there's almost 850 direct descendants of Philip O'Reilly living either in New Zealand or in Australia. Many of them are here in the Waikato. And as an interesting aside, and at times within some sectors of the broader O'Reilly family it's a somewhat controversial aside, it is strongly and proudly believed by some that Rose O'Donnell may have been of Māori descent, a member of the Ngāti Raukawa. Any assistance or advice on that, or on how a family researcher may find out definitely about that, would be very gratefully received, because it's, I think, a very important point for the O'Reillys to know, and so do some of them. And it's this sort of information which helps to take the family history out into the public arena. Suddenly there is this possibility of an entirely new branch of the family to be considered, one with deep and extensive roots in New Zealand. Be that as it may, Philip and Rose stayed on at their farm until 1920, when they sold and bought a farm at Te Kawa, south of Te Awamutu. They later lived to Kiukiu, north of Otrahonga. Rose died in 1933, and on March the 25th, 1947, more than 120 of Philip's friends and descendants gathered at Taukuri to celebrate what everyone believed was Pop O'Reilly's 100th birthday. He got congratulatory telegrams from King George VI, from the Governor-General Sir Bernard Freyberg, and from Bishop Liston, the Bishop of Auckland. And almost 50 years later, his granddaughter, Teresa, who is a great family historian, discovered that Philip was not born until 1855. And the celebrations had been 8 years early, but the old man sat there stolidly smoking his pipe and thoroughly enjoying the event. Yet he was a devoutly staunch Catholic man, and the grandson notes that he remembers Grandad Philip getting on his knees every night to say his prayers. He lived in retirement for many years among his family, largely in the Te Awamutu area, and according to Teresa, when the old man finally died in 1947 at the home of his daughter, Alice, of Te Kawa, Alice Gibson, his last act was to punch the air with his fist and call out loudly, "Open the gate, Peter." Unfortunately, the punch also caught poor Alice right in the face as she was bending over tending him. Now, while I believe that the shakers and the breakers and the history makers should undoubtedly be given their rightful place in the official records of history, it's left to the ordinary, everyday people to provide us and those who follow with the reality of what their lives and times really tasted, felt, sounded and looked like. For this reason, and also because she really loves seeking out big and small nuggets of family history, Teresa continues her hunt for further detail of the descendants of those early O'Reilly family members. In the Waikato, there are at least 160 known direct descendants of Philip, with more than 80 in the Te Awamutu area. Family names include Gibson, Gibbs, Rooney, White and McNamara, Malone, Travers and Phillips, as well as a number of O'Reillys. One of Philip O'Reilly's great-grandsons is former captain of the Māori All Blacks and Waikato Chiefs rugby captain John O'Gibbs. Other New Zealand family names stemming from Philip's parents, Thomas and Mary O'Reilly, include Burke, Power, Prendergast, Collins and Henley. So there's a pretty broad brush of people out there somewhere, all part of this O'Reilly clan. However, as Teresa continues to accumulate this considerable amount of detail on the family, including early family records, so the detail is growing. And she's keen to locate more diaries, letters, photographs and family anecdotes about any and all members of the O'Reilly family. So if anyone has any detail or any suggestions on how she may track down that detail, I would be delighted to know. Thank you.